Our afternoon session. We concluded the morning session discussing on security and defense in Europe, and this will lead us to the issues that we will discuss in the afternoon, at least for the first presentation by Amokles of the International of the ILEIS in Luxembourg. That would talk about the setting up of the steel and coal community in the beginning of the 50s, up to reach the so-called defense community, European defense community, that has been mentioned this morning many times, and would bring to the first political attempt at the beginning of the 50s. So I give the floor to Mr. Mokles.
You know how it is to give a speech or whatever after lunch. I don't know. I didn't have lunch here. I don't know how good the lunch was or how opulent. But I think the biggest moral duty of any speaker after a lunch is to keep people awake or wake them up if they fall asleep. So I would try my best. I would not give some conventional speech, being a kind of anarchist, intellectually at least, but even beyond. I was very interested in these issues long ago, unfortunately, when I came to Florence in '78, and I worked with the late Professor Lipkens. Some in the room may have known him. He died then in the wake of a very sordid affair which should have caused the demise of the European Institute a few years after it was built. But I don't want to tell you something as that sordid just after lunch. It's not dirty, just sordid, but still. My old friend Joe Weiler has left because he has to be back in Florence before the sun will set. As we know, it's a shame. During the 16 years I worked with Harvard, I met him very often there at the law school and else. He never came to my conferences because they took place normally on Friday and Saturday, and you can't convince Joe to do anything on a Saturday. So, as I noticed, not even on a Friday evening. I learned this morning 2 new names of him, Halevi Horowitz. So it's Joseph Halevi Horowitz Weiler. I didn't know this. After I know him for 30 years. Antonio, did you know this? These 2 names, additional names? So I did this. Le projet de CED du plan Pleven au crime du 30 août, the crime from Pleven plan to 30th of August 54. So the EDC was buried 11 days after Signor De Gasperi died. I realized, yes, I had never thought about this, but 19th of August, so 54. So he didn't see the demise of the EDC. But one of my conclusions, I haven't looked at this for decades, and I'm not a historian anyway. I have just this PhD in history and civilization, but I don't have the mind of a historian or the skills, intellectual skills, whatever I try. So, and as we all know, PhDs don't mean much, even not in these days. And now, of course, almost nothing, as we all know. So one conclusion was that even if the scheme, the project of the EDC had been implemented, it probably would not have led to something that would have changed drastically for the better the quality of Europe, or given it a new destiny, considering the general political and strategic environment that was to characterize Europe after the early 50s. The European defense community, one has to realize, was not a project born out of strengths, not any kind of strengths, not political strengths, not moral strengths, not economic strengths or strategic strengths or military strengths. It was born out of terrible weakness and out of defeat, not just military, but above all moral defeat. And that was a major, of course, impediment for it, and a major intrinsic weakness. One wanted to set up something different, but this came out more of the brain than of the heart, whatever the rhetoric or around it may have been. I mean, think about France in those years after the defeat, after Vichy, the collaboration, and then entangled in all kinds of colonial strifes. Indochina above all, and that was also then finally the defeat of France at Dien Bien Phu. The government of Mendes France that dealt a fatal blow to the event in France. But even without this, it may not have succeeded, because meanwhile, and in a sense from the beginning, from October 50 on, the fear of losing its military sovereignty was an increasingly greater than the fear of seeing Germany rearmed, or seeing a renascent, as they called it in the French debate, a Wehrmacht. They used the word for the Germans. Of course, it was for Adenauer something very, very interesting to regain some esteem by its former enemies, the former enemies of Germans. After, if you think back, a few years after Germans had committed probably the greatest atrocities in human history. And of course, Adenauer, that would be a chapter by itself, was an extremely astute and clever politician who used the weakness to turn it into strength. I'm from Luxembourg, part of Benelux. It's hard these days to say one is from Luxembourg, but I'm from Luxembourg. Yes, I feel a bit ashamed myself also now, because the name Luxembourg is now associated with all kinds of cheating and whatever. But Luxembourg, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, they played some role, especially through a politician like somebody who was very active since the thought is Paul-Henri Spaak, who, strangely enough, was not mentioned this morning in the context of de Gasperi and Schuman and Adenauer. I was not at the second session, I'm sorry, but perhaps he was mentioned there. But they didn't play an important role, and mi dispiace, Italy neither. So, but the UK was not part of it, who refused to join the scheme, played an extremely important role because of its absence. That may have been decisive, finally. Also in the Assemblée Nationale, National Assembly in Paris, the fact that Britain was not there. Because Britain has its own ambitions. This war was still a few years before Suez, as you know, and they had their dreams about greatness, and even France. In those years, the Gaullists came back mightily, and of course, de Gaulle behind it himself, and the dreams of a new grandeur despite the defeat. There was the Russian factor, the Soviet factor. They had still their plans for a neutral Germany, reunified, neutral, even demilitarized Central Europe. That played a role. There was the fear of Russia a few years after the so-called division gap, this famous 175 divisions opposed to perhaps only 12 operational Western divisions. This is all recollection 30 years ago. At my age, you remember better the past, fortunately for this presentation, than what happened yesterday, yes? Isn't it? Yes. I turn 65 tomorrow. So, but Stalin died then in early March '53. That was another important factor. So there was like a beginning of a slight thaw in the East-West relations. The United States of America were quite ambivalent if you look at these few years from '50 to '54. At the very end, they became very insistent, even using kind of strong pressure and even a kind of blackmail, Dulles' famous agonizing reappraisal of the transatlantic relations. But of course, for the Americans and for the British, there was NATO, and the EDC was at best to be an assistant, an aid, an auxiliary device, a kind of pillar for NATO, to help NATO, make NATO stronger. One should see this very, very clearly. Of course, they didn't want an autonomous military strategic Europe. So you see, there was also a lot of ambivalence and a lot of hypocrisy around this scheme. Still, there was a shock when it then finally was defeated on 30th of August, '54. But as you know, then very soon people were looking for alternatives, admitting Germany into NATO, transforming the Western Union into the West European Union first, and starting a kind of rearmament. And then, and you know, most in this room know this better than me, the relaunching of the whole integration process with the Messina conference leading into the Rome treaties. But one thing is clear, there was a kind of federalist approach or vision for Europe, for the future of Europe in those years. And this vision certainly died. This approach died with the EDC. And the EPC, which is very often forgotten, and talking about De Gasperi, one should, of course, mention the famous Article 38. This is a kind of supranational quality and a political community. So the political community, defense community, all this constituting perhaps what Karl Deutsch called a security community. And whether he distinguished, I'm also no longer teaching or professor, but between a pluralistic and an amalgamated security community. So I don't know what the EDC would have become, probably not really amalgamated in the terms of Karl Deutsch, but clearly after this there was not even anymore a serious effort. If you look into the 60s, when it comes to political integration, it was not even called anymore integration, but cooperation with the Fouché plans, which were very clearly intergovernmental in their philosophy, as well the Davignon plans, the Tindemans plans, and all these plans, which are probably largely forgotten except by some academic experts. So Europe never turned back to this track of integration. On the contrary, it moved away more and more. It didn't deepen, it just enlarged geographically. There was this dichotomy which is still with us, with the Europeans. 25 years ago, when I was also working as a freelance, but at a very high level, which is probably also only possible in a small country like Luxembourg. When I was chairman, when Luxembourg had the presidency of several groups, the Asia group, but also the policy planners, we had these debates, people arguing, and intelligent people like Robert Cooper and so on, deepening and widening are compatible. I always rejected this. It's not serious to argue this. And we should at least know now it wasn't and it can't be. They were, and then if you look at the real, in theory perhaps you can come up with such a compatibility, but if you look at the real Europe, what we have seen over the decades is the strengthening of the centrifugal forces in Europe and the weakening of the centripetal forces and the growing heterogeneity in Europe. And this is going on. So one can also ask a question, and then what about today? Can one still conceive of such a scheme like was EPC and EDC as concomitant or more than concomitant projects? I think absolutely not. It would be even ridiculous, even only to think about it. But how long have I talked? Did you check the watch? No. So
10 minutes.
I give you just some fragments. As you see, I don't give a coherent talk. I don't try either to deconstruct Europe more than it is already, or it has deconstructed itself. So it's not something postmodernist I give you. But one can even think that the European defense community was already then a desperate but hopeless effort to reconstruct what had been definitively demolished. One can ask counterintuitive or counterfactual questions such as where would Europe stand today in 2014 if it had been implemented, the scheme of an EDC. Would Europe today be more integrated? I don't know. We should perhaps have a discussion about this. I think if you ask 10 people, they have 10 different opinions on this. Perhaps this scheme would have imposed a certain discipline on the actors, and it would have prevented perhaps this wild, senseless, blind enlargement, this fuite en avant, Flucht nach vorne, which had already also in itself something desperate. If we can't deepen, let's move on. And everybody knows this, that who was pushing for this, and not just the British, and those who joined, most of them were. So if Joe Weiler would be here, I would remind him here. I had talked already decades ago about this three key words. He wrote an article on this, on ethos, telos, and demos. So there's no European demos still, and there's less than ever in the history of European integration, perhaps. Ethos. What does bind today's Europe together? What do you think? I don't see much. It can be something positive, it can be something negative. Negative, it can be a threat, a challenge from outside, kind of external, negative, federator, what was, in a sense, Soviet Union, but can it be today? Some people think so. Can it be Russia again? Some people think, not just in Poland and the Baltic states, that one can get a stronger integration by inflating the new Russian threat. But does this not say enough about, in itself, about the sad state Europe is in? It's not through Russia bashing that we are constructing a strong Western Europe, strong political or even security or even defense entity. So ethos, what else could it be? Common values. What are these values? Human rights, democracy, freedom, liberal democracy, liberty. But our society is not becoming more illiberal by the day. People of my generation, or somebody as sensitive as me at least, I'm shocked every time I travel by how we are treated at airports, because we are so afraid of some threats, I think largely illusory. History, anxiety in general, to use a less strong word, is on the increase. And we are cutting away our own liberties. I went out of this building to come back. It was the Carabinieri first and so on. This is not the Italy I knew. And why this is, there's a threat to our security. There's militant Islam or Islamism, perhaps, or all these only pretexts to move us into, and without us becoming aware of it, into a very different society. I wouldn't call it immediately totalitarian, but are we perhaps on the way to this? So, ethos and telos, what could be the aim, the long-term purpose, the finalité of this whole undertaking? Asking this question in 2014. So 60 years after the demise, it's 60 years, I just realized, after the demise of the scheme of the European defense community. But this goes far beyond of this conference. I don't know also what Alcide De Gasperi would have said if he would see the present situation. What he would say about what Europe has done or what has happened to Europe, European construction européenne, or unification as it once was called. And what I meant, to use a few more conceptual terms, Europe before the EDC plan was, of course, you may call it on a functionalist, theoretically speaking, track, and then there came in this federalist intermezzo, and when that broke down, it was finished, this experience, then perhaps there was some effort at moving towards a kind of neo-functionalist approach underlying this whole efforts. So moving away from low politics, as Stanley Hoffman called it, into the realm of high politics. But you may decide for yourself what, how successful this has been. So we have NATO. We are partners of the United States. People want to strengthen that relationship. But is this good for Europe? I personally think it was always an illusion to think you can build a strong Europe together with a strong transatlantic relationship. It's either or. And this was not honestly, there's a lack of intellectual honesty there. This was not recognized as an absolute dilemma. Of course, the United States was bent on weakening Europe. They didn't want a very, very weak Europe, but not a very strong one, too. They wanted a dependent one. And that's what they still want today. They want NATO. They want to strengthen even NATO. It's absolutely ridiculous. NATO has no raison d'etre anymore. NATO conceptually is dead because NATO is built what very few experts only understand, and not even all these important theoretical elements seem to be forgotten. NATO is built on collective defense, and collective defense vanished with the end of the Soviet Union. So as the Arbatov Senior said, we did the worst thing we could have done to you, to NATO. We took the enemy away. So NATO is without a purpose anymore. So it's ludicrous to try to strengthen it, revitalize it. I want to say, so the real questions for Europe are, how can we build a more decent society? And nobody is talking about this. Nobody. A decent society. There's an Israeli professor, scholar, philosopher, Joe Weiler knows him very well, Avishai Margalit, who wrote a book on this, A Decent Society. But that's what we should keep. How can we try modestly to build a somewhat more decent society? Because we are moving away more and more. We are obsessed by all kinds of economic indicators. Europe, what can it represent, we have to ask, in the world? What kind of model? Is there a moral model for the world? Is there a cultural model? There was a European high culture, but there's no longer a high culture in Europe. There's not even contemporary culture. We call it culture, but it's not culture anymore. So Europe has exported some culture to the United States, but what we got back was American barbarism. And this is about the whole story is about the decline of Europe, the decay of Europe, and is this decline reversible? These are the very big questions. I don't want to go into philosophy of history. Have I talked already 25 minutes? My goodness. Asia may, in terms of grand strategy, may take over, or parts of Asia, at the global power politics level, but we don't know what kind of model or cultural model they will offer. Will there emerge at some point a nation high culture? I doubt somewhat. I personally, I have to admit, since I was 14 or so, I have been obsessed by decline. Mal du siècle was my first interest in. And then all these Western philosophers of decline, you can count who has read in this room one of the most important books in the West, written in the last 1,000 years, Balthasar Gracian, a Criticon. I recommend it if you haven't read it yet. And of course, more recent, or in Italy, since we're in Italy, Leopardi, read Leopardi. Or if you're Spanish, Ortega y Gasset, Spengler. These are not well seen. Toynbee, so he's more neutral. Or before him, Nietzsche. So all these factors, where are we heading for? What can give Europe strength? God is dead, but Nietzsche is also dead. Yes, so Nietzsche didn't realize this, perhaps, or not before it was too late. So these are the great questions for our becoming, le devenir, das Werden, Europas. Let's not hesitate to put it in a greater context. Let's not hesitate, and let's not escape the decisive questions for possible future of Europe. The EDC was one brave small effort. So to conclude, I don't know if it would have changed the fate or the face of Europe. The jury is still out. As who was it? Zhou Enlai, who said about the French Revolution when he was asked what he thought about the outcome of the French Revolution. He said it's too early to tell. Yes, it's no joke. Probably you have heard it. Sorry for that. I don't like to repeat what others say. But that's certainly true with what happened 60 years ago is the EDC. We have now, Europe in a sense is blocked, is stuck, and it's a kind of grocer's Europe, but perhaps that's enough. And we should try to live with this. We don't have perhaps greater ambitions. Who would I be to tell Europe to have stronger ambitions when it is too late, perhaps anyway? So you cannot create ambition artificially. It must come from inside. It must be the deep aspiration of people and peoples. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
I start to predicate, and that's very bad. So.
Okay. Bon, merci beaucoup. Bon, la France et la France, ça a été mentionné plusieurs fois. Alors, je passe la parole à Sylvain Schirman, qui va nous expliquer pourquoi Schuman et puis l'Assemblée nationale et l'arrêt du développement de l'intégration, ou une autre histoire, on verra. Merci.
Merci. Merci d'abord de me faire l'honneur de m'associer à cette manifestation. Je vais vous raconter, j'allais dire, une histoire autour de 4 points. Le premier point, c'est le temps des illusions. Le deuxième point, c'est le temps de la confrontation à la réalité. Le troisième point, c'est le temps des révisions douloureuses. C'est un peu l'histoire de la vie, mais c'est aussi celle de l'histoire de la France entre 1944 et 1950. Et dans un quatrième point, j'ajouterai un peu les relations avec l'Italie pendant cette période qui sont marquées par ces 3 temps aussi et qui permettent peut-être de parler un tout petit peu. C'est l'hommage du président du comité scientifique de la maison Robert Schuman que je suis à la fondation Alcide de Gasperi. Sur le premier point, le temps des illusions. Tout le monde connaît l'histoire, à travers l'histoire, n'est-ce pas, de la France libre, du comité français de libération nationale, du gouvernement provisoire de la République française. On a pu accréditer cette idée que nous étions des vainqueurs de la guerre et que Vichy n'était pas la France. C'est la position officielle du général de Gaulle, en tout cas à la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, et la politique étrangère de ce pays porte indéniablement comme base cette réflexion. Ce qui veut dire qu'en fait, la France n'existait que comme puissance et se rêvait un avenir de puissance. La France n'existait comme puissance, ça supposait très simplement que l'on réfléchisse à des annexions. La France se voulait puissance, cela suppose qu'on ne devait pas brader l'Empire. La France se voulait puissance, cela voulait dire qu'on participe pleinement au règlement de la question allemande et de la sécurité de ce pays en Europe occidentale. Il suffit d'aller le 8 octobre 1945, dans un discours au retour de Rhénanie du général de Gaulle, chef du gouvernement provisoire de la République française, pour retrouver les axes que je viens très rapidement de présenter devant vous. Premier élément, annexion, oui. Si on avait pu annexer la Sarre, c'est dedans, on l'aurait annexé. Annexion, oui. Si on avait pu annexer la ville de Kehl en face de Strasbourg, on l'aurait fait. C'est très clair. Maintien de l'Empire français, oui. C'est très simple. Pas de reconnaissance de l'indépendance proclamée par Ho Chi Minh en septembre 1945 de l'Indochine, oui. Répression sévère le 8 mai 1945, jour de la fin de la guerre en Algérie, pour celles et ceux qui se souviennent encore des événements de Sétif, voilà. On peut continuer de la même façon. Quelle est l'idée en octobre 1945 du général de Gaulle? C'est extrêmement simple. La restauration de la puissance française, cela passe parce qu'il l'a enregistré dans son esprit. Pardon?
Abbiamo un servizio di traduzione. Abbiamo bisogno di...
We have a translation service and we need the translation in Italian and English. The Italian is coming simultaneous translation.
qui a des problèmes et
Do you
who
all
does not
follow
understand,
you don't need a translation?
we're all fine. We're all fine. Perfect. Please have a coffee. You deserved it.
Thank you. Thank you for your proposal. Donc, on en est là en octobre 1945, et l'idée, c'est très simple. Le général de Gaulle a enregistré que Staline était dans la partie orientale, que de facto l'Allemagne orientale allait échapper, et donc, dans ces conditions, l'Allemagne occidentale devait être, sous une forme ou sous une autre, être dans l'orbite française. Et si vous regardez le projet du 8 octobre 1945 du gouvernement français, c'est très simple. Annexion de la Sarre, annexion de Kehl, Rhénanie transformée en protectorat français, imbriquée économiquement à la France, et le reste de l'Allemagne, confédération d'États où il n'y aurait pas d'administration centrale en Allemagne. Voilà le rêve de la puissance. Deuxième élément de ce rêve de la puissance, l'Empire, je l'ai indiqué, mais très vite sur cette position, eh bien, la France est obligée de reconnaître qu'elle est isolée. La politique de puissance isole Paris. Elle isole Paris d'abord parce qu'il n'y a pas de soutien russe qu'on espérait dans la question allemande. Il faut se souvenir de cela. Staline se moque royalement du pacte signé en décembre 1944 avec le gouvernement provisoire de la République française. Il s'en moque royalement parce qu'il n'y a aucun soutien aux positions françaises sur l'Allemagne, les soviétiques restant attachés à une centralisation des administrations, à un État unique, mais bien évidemment avec l'espoir que cette Allemagne tombe sous domination entièrement des soviétiques. Aucune prise de position soviétique en faveur des positions de la France libre. On pourrait continuer ainsi. Il n'y a qu'à regarder ce qui se passe en Europe centrale et orientale pour comprendre que les desseins du général de Gaulle en la matière ne peuvent pas aboutir. En plus, réalisme aussi nécessaire à un moment ou à un autre, ou prise de conscience nécessaire à un moment ou à un autre, ces communistes qui sont quand même dans le gouvernement d'union nationale en France de 1945 à 1947 provoquent également le renvoi en janvier 1946 du général de Gaulle en ne le soutenant pas sur la réforme des institutions. Donc à partir de là, il faut se rendre à l'évidence, Staline n'est pas l'allié espéré. Deuxième élément, l'Empire. Ho Chi Minh proclame l'indépendance, le gouvernement français ne reconnaît pas cette indépendance et pourtant, il a le soutien de principe à cette époque-là et des États-Unis et de l'Union soviétique. Peut-on maintenir l'Empire contre une opposition de principe des Américains et des Russes? C'est une autre question que doit se poser la diplomatie française dès 1946. Alors, quand on se rend compte qu'on s'isole, eh bien on trouve une solution de rechange, toujours dans la première phase, n'est-ce pas, le temps des illusions. La solution de rechange, c'est le bloc occidental, dont le général de Gaulle avait parlé une première fois en 1943 à Alger. C'est-à-dire l'idée, elle est très simple, vous regroupez le Benelux, la France, l'Italie, l'Allemagne occidentale avec la Ruhr, et donc éventuellement le Royaume-Uni, qu'on espère toujours du côté français à cette époque-là, parce que ça peut être un allié contre l'Allemagne, et vous faites en sorte que la France contrôle ce type de bloc occidental. Pour le général de Gaulle, il s'agit à la fois de contrôler l'Allemagne, mais en même temps de rééquilibrer un peu la présence soviétique. Et ce bloc, c'est donc une association d'intérêts autour de la France. Et enfin, autre élément encore du réalisme, on fait étudier en 1946 une dernière option, qui est une alliance dont Antonio a parlé ce matin, Washington, Londres, Paris, c'est-à-dire un axe des trois puissances qui pourrait à la fois garantir la sécurité française et en même temps empêcher l'URSS de trop s'intéresser aux affaires occidentales. Bien, mais tant que Paris est sur ses positions, on reste isolé dans le camp des vainqueurs. Et donc, après le départ du général de Gaulle en janvier 1946, eh bien, on commence à bouger. On commence à bouger étape après étape. Il y a d'abord les négociations entre Léon Blum et Burns sur les prêts américains à la France au mois de mars 1946. À ce moment-là, le 28 mai 1946, lorsque la négociation est terminée, les Américains débloquent des prêts permettant le redémarrage de l'économie française et notamment la réalisation du plan qui est confié à Jean Monnet. Donc l'amorce de la planification modernisatrice française, c'est l'œuvre d'un rapprochement avec les États-Unis au printemps 1946. Et puis, rapprochement aussi au même moment avec les Anglais, puisqu'à partir de la fin de l'année 1946, on commence à discuter avec les Britanniques d'une alliance militaire qui va nous conduire au début de l'année 1947 au traité de Dunkerque, que tout le monde connaît ici, un traité qui est signé le 4 mars 1947 et qui montre que la France commence à renoncer à ses positions traditionnelles sur l'Allemagne. C'est une alliance franco-britannique où on n'envisage plus du tout ce protectorat rhénan, où on reconnaît la réalité telle qu'elle est là, et donc où on se dit on va à deux contre une éventuelle résurrection du problème allemand. Et puis, pendant qu'on négocie ce traité de Dunkerque, il y a quand même, et c'est ça qui est extrêmement important, le 30 janvier 1947, les 3 mémorandums français sur la question allemande. Le premier mémorandum porte sur la Sarre, le deuxième mémorandum porte sur la Ruhr, le troisième mémorandum porte sur le statut de l'Allemagne. Sur le premier, question de la Sarre, il n'est plus question de rattachement à la France, c'est donc l'abandon de la politique de 1945, il est simplement question d'une union économique franco-sarroise. Sur le deuxième, on envisage explicitement un contrôle international sur la Ruhr, donc plus seul, mais avec les autres alliés. Et enfin, sur le dernier point, on accepte le principe de l'unité étatique allemande. C'est-à-dire qu'il a fallu 2 ans pour que la position française évolue sur cette question de l'administration centrale et de l'unité étatique allemande. À partir de ce moment-là, nos positions sont plus facilement compatibles avec les positions des Américains et les positions des Britanniques sur la question allemande. Et puis ensuite, il y a quand même un certain nombre d'autres points. Lors de la conférence interalliée de Moscou au mois de mars 1947, le 10 mars 1947, on a une réponse américaine, pas aussi. Contre l'avis des Russes, les États-Unis admettent le principe d'une union économique avec la Sarre. Et 2 jours après, vous avez le discours de Truman, 12 mars 1947, le containment, et ce discours-là provoque un choc en France, parce qu'en fait, les non-communistes du gouvernement français prennent conscience du nouvel enjeu, qui est la guerre froide, là où Paris pratiquait de la politique puissance traditionnelle. Et donc, à partir du mois de mars 1947, eh bien, le départ du 5 mai 1947 des communistes du gouvernement est inscrit en filigrane aussi au niveau de la France. Mais même là, on n'a pas encore complètement basculé. Parce que je vous rappelle, juste pour mémoire, qu'au moment du plan Marshall, les autorités françaises convoquent à Paris une conférence avec l'Union soviétique et le Royaume-Uni. Et l'idée aussi du Quai d'Orsay, c'est de réussir à convaincre l'Union soviétique d'accepter le plan Marshall, parce que dans la future question allemande, on n'est pas de trop si l'Union soviétique était dans cette discussion. C'est le refus soviétique au début du mois de juillet 1947, très précisément le 3 juillet 1947, qui amène Paris, cette fois-ci, à jouer très clairement la carte occidentale. Et s'il faut un gouvernement qui montre que l'on joue la carte occidentale, c'est le gouvernement Schuman. Vous savez que Schuman, avant d'être ministre des Affaires étrangères, a été président du Conseil, donc chef du gouvernement. Il est chef du gouvernement dans cette année 1947. Et il est chef du gouvernement au moment des grandes grèves. Je prends des éléments internes qui sont toujours importants. Vous avez les grandes grèves communistes d'octobre-novembre 1947 en France. Et c'est dans ces grandes grèves, fomentées par le Parti communiste et la CGT, que le 22 novembre 1947, Schuman explique qu'il est dorénavant question, je cite, de s'appuyer pleinement sur les États-Unis tout en essayant d'organiser l'Europe. 22 novembre 1947. Là, vous pouvez dire que la France, par rapport au thème de votre conférence, la préférence occidentale, elle est affirmée pour la première fois. Donc, le temps du réalisme, si vous voulez, commence réellement. Et lors de la conférence de Londres fin 1947, le ministre des Affaires étrangères de Robert Schuman, Bidault, expose aux Anglais et aux Américains cette nouvelle ligne. Nous sommes prêts à discuter de la fusion des zones occidentales en Allemagne, de la mise en place d'une coopération occidentale en matière de sécurité. Et dès lors, en parallèle, des conversations secrètes commencent entre militaires anglais, français et américains pour réfléchir à un organisme militaire de sécurité. Ce sont les premières discussions à Washington vers ce que vous avez exposé ce matin, la création de l'OTAN. Et donc, vous pouvez affirmer qu'à la fin de l'année 1947, Paris est maintenant pleinement dans le camp occidental. Mais ça ne veut pas dire qu'on renonce à la politique de puissance. Elle devra maintenant se faire, si vous voulez, dans le cadre du camp occidental. Et donc, on peut passer à la troisième phase, c'est-à-dire la douloureuse acceptation d'un État ouest-allemand pour les Français en contrepartie de la garantie de la sécurité. Là aussi, c'est des étapes qui amènent à cela. Première étape, le coup de Prague. Au lendemain du coup de Prague, vous le savez, c'est la signature du pacte de Bruxelles qui fonde l'Union occidentale entre le Benelux, le Royaume-Uni et la France, qui prévoit, et c'est ça qui est importé aux Français aussi, une clause d'assistance contre l'Allemagne, pas simplement l'URSS. Et lorsque le pacte atlantique, ce qui est toujours intéressant, ça a été relevé aussi ce matin, c'est des histoires de perception, lorsque le pacte atlantique est conclu le 4 avril 1949, le gouvernement français le considère comme un succès essentiel. Certes, tout le monde a en tête l'Union soviétique, mais pour la France, il y a une clause non dite, c'est que ce pacte sert aussi contre l'Allemagne, éventuellement, dans le cadre des négociations et de cette alliance tant rêvée à Paris qu'on n'a jamais pu obtenir au lendemain de la Première Guerre mondiale, c'est-à-dire l'alliance avec les États-Unis et le Royaume-Uni. C'est certes pas écrit, l'Allemagne, mais ça va de soi pour les autorités françaises que les États-Unis se sont engagés indirectement à préserver la sécurité de la France dans le cadre d'une renaissance allemande. Et donc, à Paris, on parle aussi dans certains milieux, je cite, d'une belle revanche par rapport à 1919, où on n'a pas obtenu la garantie américaine. On l'a maintenant. Partant de là, la question atlantique est essentiellement liée pour Paris à la question allemande et à la création d'un État allemand. La conclusion à Londres, le 1er juin 1948, du processus qui lance la fusion des trois zones occidentales et de la création de la RFA, elle accorde pleinement satisfaction à certains désirs français. Autorité internationale sur la Roure, on l'a. Souveraineté du nouvel État limitée par un statut d'occupation. Réservant l'autorité suprême aux trois, on l'a. En France, décentralisation maximale du nouvel État, on l'a encore avec la création des Länder tels qu'ils ont été créés, qui ne correspond pas toujours à ce qu'on entend, à une réalité historique telle qu'elle en Allemagne. C'est du découpage administratif qui a été fait parfois sur mesure. Il n'y a qu'à regarder le Bade-Wurtemberg. Ce n'est pas le président qui me contredira sur ce chapitre. Et enfin, le problème français, il est ailleurs. C'est que si les dirigeants ont conscience de cette évolution et amènent le pays, le problème, il est ailleurs, c'est faire accepter ça à l'opinion. Et vous allez voir, dès 1948, dès les résultats de la conférence de Londres, la difficulté à faire passer cette occidentalisation, entre guillemets, et cette conversion à la réorganisation de l'Europe à la Chambre des députés et dans l'opinion française. Parce que la conférence de Londres, le 17 juin 1948, lorsque ces accords doivent être ratifiés à l'Assemblée nationale, je vous le signale quand même, ils ont été ratifiés avec une majorité de 8 voix, ce qui est une ratification de justesse pour quelque chose qui décide quand même d'une orientation majeure de la politique extérieure française. Je peux continuer sur ce plan. Cette solidarité atlantique, la création de la RFA, elle comporte aussi un risque. C'est que si on ne change pas de politique à l'égard de l'Allemagne nouvelle, on s'isole cette fois-ci non pas simplement sur la scène internationale, mais on s'isole de nouveau dans le camp occidental. Et c'est ça le grand mérite de Schuman, c'est de comprendre cela très tôt. C'est-à-dire sans avoir de projet CK en tête, dont tout le monde sait que l'idée revient à Jean Monnet. Mais vous prenez les conférences de presse, les discours, et vous verrez dès le mois de juillet-août 1949, c'est-à-dire en gros un an avant la déclaration du 9 mai, des allusions à Schuman à la question allemande, où il explique qu'il faut changer de cap vis-à-vis de l'Allemagne. Le cap, il ne peut pas vous le définir parce qu'il faut être honnête. Les saints-pères, il faut en parler, mais il ne faut pas trop les sanctifier non plus. En août 1949, il ne savait pas quel serait le contenu de cette nouvelle politique qu'il appelait de ses voeux. En tout état de cause, pour aller rapidement, l'avancée du communisme, Chine, c'est octobre 1949, perspective de Corée. Pour aller plus loin encore, les premières déclarations qu'on oublie très souvent d'un Konrad Adenauer, qui font du bruit en France. Le nouveau chancelier explique que la Sarre doit redevenir allemande au plus vite. Le nouveau chancelier parle de souveraineté de l'Allemagne. Eh bien, regardez ce que ça peut produire comme effet de l'autre côté du Rhin. C'est un peu trop tôt d'envisager cela. Il ne faut jamais oublier qu'on est 4 ans après la sortie de la guerre. Vous allez faire passer ça aux associations de résistants, aux anciens combattants, parce que je vous mets la politique telle qu'elle se pratique. Et l'opinion française ne peut pas facilement admettre cela. Et donc, tout cela ne donne que davantage de mérite à ce duo Monnet-Schuman qui comprend très vite que malgré cela, il faut prendre une autre direction. Et pour Schuman, j'allais dire, même si ce n'est pas le concepteur du plan, prendre le risque politique. C'est ça, pour moi, l'apport majeur. C'est-à-dire prendre le risque politique face à une opinion qui n'est pas fondamentalement pro-européenne. Je peux vous dire que dans son département d'origine, qui est le département de la Moselle, on n'est pas pro-européen en 1950. Il n'y a qu'à regarder les campagnes de presse que font les 2 journaux locaux contre le ministre français, qui est l'élu du département, à ce moment-là, pour comprendre un peu, j'allais dire, l'initiative politique majeure prise par Robert Schuman à ce moment-là. Mais cette déclaration Schuman, elle suscite d'emblée aussi un profond malentendu en France. Et ce malentendu, puisque vous avez fait de la prospective, ce malentendu vis-à-vis de l'Europe, vous le retrouvez jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Quel est ce malentendu? Pour Schuman, pour Jean Monnet, pour certains de leurs amis, qui viennent pour l'essentiel du MRP, certains aussi de la SFIO, parce que toute la SFIO n'est pas anti-européenne, pas André Philippe, ces éléments-là sont très europhiles. Pour ces gens-là, le plan, certes, répond à des objectifs nationaux, mais ce n'est pas sa finalité. Sa finalité, c'est la construction d'une Europe à perspective fédérale, comme c'est si bien rappelé dans le texte. Mais pour d'autres qui vont soutenir le plan, on fait une lecture très nationale du plan Schuman. Il s'inscrit dans la volonté, si vous voulez, très simple, qui est qu'en maintenant l'Empire, qui n'est pas encore parti en lambeaux, auquel on s'agrippe encore en 1950, qu'en maintenant l'Empire, qu'en maintenant une relation privilégiée avec les États-Unis et le Royaume-Uni, on vient de se doter d'un instrument de sécurité supplémentaire qui est le contrôle de l'Allemagne, le contrôle de la politique extérieure de l'Allemagne, le contrôle de ses richesses fondamentales, le charbon, et donc par voie de conséquence, on est, avec le plan Schuman, dans un élément pour eux de puissance française. Et cet aspect-là non plus, il ne faut pas l'oublier, parce qu'on a là en germe des conflits franco-français qui traversent tout le rapport de la France avec la construction européenne. Et que vous retrouvez encore en 2005, au moment du référendum sur la Constitution européenne. Et que vous allez retrouver immédiatement dans ce que vous avez évoqué, la question de la CED. D'emblée, c'est présent, et cela porte en germe non seulement des conflits franco-français, mais des éléments de crise européenne, comme le prouve la question de la CED. Et donc, j'allais dire, le difficile ancrage de la France à l'Ouest, sous son double aspect, alignement sur Washington et nouvelle politique allemande, montre en tout cas que le deuil de la politique de puissance reste quelque chose de problématique en France, y compris avec le plan Schuman. Reste à évoquer peut-être quelques éléments, si vous le permettez encore, sur le franco-italien. Bien, écoutez, quand vous prenez les relations entre la France et l'Italie, pour faire bref, vous pouvez les inscrire dans cette chronologie que je viens d'évoquer. Dans un premier temps, en France, on n'a pas pardonné, vous m'excusez l'expression, surtout ici, le coup de poignard dans le dos de l'Italie en 1940. Donc, dans un premier temps, quand vous prenez les positions du gouvernement provisoire de la République française, elles sont à inscrire dans cette politique de puissance. Les affaires annexionnistes, mais je mets un point d'interrogation parce que je pense qu'elles ne sont pas sérieuses. On a parlé à un moment donné de Vintimille et du Val d'Aoste. Je crois plutôt que c'est de l'autre côté qu'on a instrumentalisé des visées françaises qui n'existaient pas réellement. Il y avait peut-être quelques, j'allais dire, francs-tireurs qui parlaient de cela, mais en aucun cas, en regardant les archives, on a eu des projets annexionnistes globaux comme on a pu les avoir pour la Sarre ou pour Kehl, où là je peux vous décrire tout ce qu'on voulait faire. En réalité, c'est l'évolution de la politique française à partir de 1946 qui va commencer à rapprocher les deux États. Ça a été évoqué un peu ce matin. On a ce gouvernement dirigé par Robert Schuman et où Georges Bidault est ministre des Affaires étrangères qui intensifie les relations, même si celles-là ont commencé à se réchauffer dès 1946. Il faut dire qu'il y a un certain nombre de parallèles à faire. On a des fronts intérieurs chez les démocrates chrétiens et les fronts intérieurs, c'est les communistes. On a donc, dans le cas italien comme dans le cas français, intérêt à se soutenir face aux communistes. Et tout le monde connaît ici, je pense, le ralliement de la France à la thèse italienne sur Trieste, dans ces années-là, par la déclaration de Georges Bidault au nom du gouvernement français en mars 1948. Mais là aussi, ce n'est pas dans un sens, c'est aussi dans l'autre sens. C'est l'Italie qui a fait quand même un certain nombre de pas vers la France au moment de la négociation des traités de paix en 1947, jusqu'à, j'allais dire, ce magnifique projet sur lequel je ne reviendrai pas, mais que tout le monde connaît, d'union douanière franco-italien, dont les noms, n'est-ce pas, sont à eux seuls un poème, entre, voilà, Fritalux, etc., etc. L'idée quand même, si on peut me permettre deux mots sur cette union douanière, c'est quand même un jeu du chat et de la souris. Paris ne rêve pas fondamentalement d'une union douanière avec l'Italie. Ce qui est important dans l'affaire, c'est de plaire aux Américains, de plaire aux Britanniques, de faire un pas, de montrer qu'on est clairement dans le camp occidental. Donc, d'amener l'Italie, plus d'autres calculs. Comme il y aura renaissance d'un État allemand, il vaut peut-être mieux avoir l'Italie dans une alliance qu'on espère d'abord avec le Royaume-Uni, mais accessoirement aussi avec les États du Benelux et accessoirement aussi avec l'Italie. Donc c'est un jeu de géopolitique du côté français, là où les Italiens ont été au début beaucoup plus intéressés par le traité de libre-échange. Mais simplement, quand ils comprennent aussi la réalité française, ils savent s'en amuser. Parce qu'ils savent très bien qu'on peut jouer les Américains et les Britanniques aussi contre la France dans ce traité de libre-échange. Et donc les ambiguïtés des deux côtés font que le traité échoue. Que dire encore pour ne pas prendre trop de temps? Il faut quand même souligner, dès le lendemain de la proposition Schuman, la réponse quasi immédiate du gouvernement italien, par l'intermédiaire de Sforza, le 10 mai 1950, qui explique que l'Italie est prête à donner tout de suite son adhésion et toute sa coopération. Mais, je crois que ça a été souligné dans l'exposé ce matin avec réalisme. C'est-à-dire, dans cette opération qui commence, il ne faut pas sacrifier les intérêts économiques de l'Italie et au besoin ouvrir certains chapitres de la négociation qui ne sont pas prévus pour la déclaration Schuman, notamment la question sociale, qui est importante en termes de première politique CECA. Le 3 juin 1950, au moment de l'ouverture des négociations, lorsque le communiqué annonce l'ouverture des négociations sur les bases proposées par la France, eh bien, on a là cette petite communauté intégrée à l'ouest de l'Europe qui se met en place. Simplement, je voudrais peut-être là aussi mentionner deux choses qui sont identiques. Les deux pays où la ratification du traité de Paris sont les plus difficiles, c'est la France et l'Italie. Ça nous rapproche, il faut le dire. L'Italie est la dernière à ratifier, là où les autres sont rapides. Chez nous, la difficulté de la ratification, elle prend un tour un peu plus délicat, puisque c'est le temps que les moins de 20 ans ne peuvent plus connaître, comme dit la chanson, où la France avait encore un système parlementaire et donc élisait sa chambre à la proportionnelle, la 4e République. Et donc les élections de juin 1951 sont les élections les plus difficiles qu'a eu à supporter Robert Schuman, parce qu'il est candidat, le traité est signé le 18 avril 1951, il faut élire la nouvelle Chambre en juin 1951, c'est la Chambre qui va ratifier, et les élections de Schuman qui est élu haut la main depuis 1919 dans sa Moselle natale, qui sera réélu haut la main en 1956. Les élections les plus difficiles, ce sont les élections de 1951, où il s'en sort à 4000 voix près. C'est-à-dire que toute l'opposition a mobilisé sur le département du président Schuman, avec une alliance objective que je peux vous montrer entre communistes et gaullistes, avec l'aide du patronat sidérurgique français, qui ne voulait pas de la CK. Or, la sidérurgie, elle est bien concentrée aussi en partie dans ce département de la Moselle. En partie, mais pas totalement. Et donc, à 4000 voix près, Schuman était battu. Et vous imaginez un débat de ratification sans le porteur du projet. Voilà. Donc, chez nous, la difficulté est autre. La défaite envisagée à un moment donné du père fondateur. Et donc, ce qu'il faut, à partir de là, ajouter, c'est que les Schuman, à partir du moment où le traité est ratifié, porte quand même avec Alcide de Gasperi la question de la communauté politique européenne qui a été évoquée par vous il y a un instant. Là aussi, n'est-ce pas, on voit que pour lui, la CK, ce n'est qu'un pas du côté de Schuman. Ce n'est pas la finalité, c'est le pas, c'est toujours la même idée. Mais en même temps, les ambiguïtés françaises ne disparaissent pas puisque le 30 août 1954, ceux qui rêvent de ces politiques européennes comme d'une politique de puissance nationale font capoter ce projet par trop fédéral. Et là aussi, sans injurier qui que ce soit ici, l'Italie a les mêmes difficultés avec la CED, puisque le gouvernement italien n'a pas encore ratifié le texte au moment où le gouvernement français le rejette. Ce qui montre bien, allez, un petit peu de choses provocantes, que ce n'est pas l'Angleterre qui inaugure le système, je ratifie après tout le monde, mais bien l'Italie sur la question de la communauté européenne de défense. Parenthèse close. Il faut bien voir que l'approfondissement de la politique à l'ouest de la France doit beaucoup à Schuman, même s'il ne fut pas le premier inspirateur. Là aussi, c'est vrai. Il complète, par la réconciliation avec Bonn, une orientation commencée dès 1947, amplifiée fin 1947 par son gouvernement. L'ancrage de la France dans le front occidental, la renonciation à sa politique de puissance traditionnelle et la modification de son attitude séculaire à l'égard de l'Allemagne durent peut-être beaucoup à la présence à la tête de gouvernements, de personnalités aussi en qui l'homme d'État français avait réellement confiance. Adenauer, de Gasperi, Joseph Bech, auquel il faut ajouter Paul-Henri Spaak, qu'il a découvert en 1948. Avant, Schuman ne le connaissait pas, mais c'était une trouvaille. J'ai eu beaucoup d'interviews là-dessus. Parce que les deux hommes n'auraient peut-être pas passé leurs vacances ensemble, tellement ils étaient opposés, mais une réelle amitié est partie en 1948 entre Schuman et Spaak. Avec les premiers, c'est-à-dire notamment avec Adenauer, de Gasperi et Bech, Schuman partageait bien des points communs, tous mus par une foi catholique, on l'a souligné, qui était indiscutable. Ils sont aussi quelque part, faut-il le rappeler, les héritiers du Zentrum, c'est-à-dire d'un parti catholique allemand, c'est ça leur enfance. Ce n'est pas le catholicisme à la française des Maritains, l'horizon d'un Robert Schuman, c'est le catholicisme allemand du Zentrum, comme Adenauer. Et donc, si l'on regarde leur parcours et leurs premiers engagements politiques et sociaux, c'est dans cette mouvance-là qu'elle se fait. Elle ne se fait pas dans le catholicisme critique d'après 1920 en France. C'est d'ailleurs en allemand leur langue commune, maternelle, pour ne pas dire plus, qu'ils conversaient systématiquement entre eux. Tous ont été peu, je voudrais relever des synergies, tous ont été peu engagés, il faut le dire, et c'est pas en leur défaveur, dans l'européisme de l'entre-deux-guerres, à l'exception d'un Konrad Adenauer qui a été membre de l'Union pan-européenne de Koudnow, mais sans être un leader de premier plan. Et c'est à la faveur de la guerre, et aussi, il faut peut-être le rappeler pour ces politiciens du monde catholique, les modifications de l'Église en matière d'organisation internationale au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Si vous regardez les positions de l'Église pendant l'entre-deux-guerres sur les organisations internationales, notamment la Société des Nations, où se déroulait quand même le débat européen, il y a quand même une attitude critique, c'est le moins que l'on puisse dire. Cette modification aussi de l'Église en matière de construction européenne et d'organisation internationale, que ces personnalités surent explorer d'autres voies, celle du renforcement de la solidarité occidentale, de la défense de ses valeurs, un renforcement qui n'avait de sens que si les États européens eux-mêmes, au nom de ces valeurs, abandonnent leur politique, pour le cas de la France, de puissance, pour entamer leur propre réconciliation. Cela assurait à court terme la survie de leurs nations respectives, et je rejoins ce qu'a dit Antonio ce matin sur le patriotisme. Là, il y a une dimension patriotique importante, puisqu'on pense à la survie de ses propres États, mais il est un autre trait commun qu'il faut mentionner. Chacun d'entre eux, à l'exception de Bech, devait faire face à un front communiste intérieur en ce qui concerne Schuman et de Gasperi, sous forme de zone d'occupation, puis d'État, pour le cas d'Adenauer, dans la réalité du problème allemand. Cette conversion, en tout cas, ménageait l'avenir à long terme. Merci.
So we're coming to the last presentation of this afternoon. Joseph Bech has been mentioned, Paul-Henri Spaak, Benelux also a couple of times. What can we say? Small is beautiful. What is the story of Benelux countries? Please, Etienne Deschamps.
Grazie. Non sapevo.
Thank you. I didn't know I could speak French. And I wanted to speak Italian. But unfortunately, I am not fluent enough, and therefore I have prepared my text in English. I would like to thank the De Gasperi Foundation for inviting me here today. And I would like to also to thank all those who are rallying outside the building.
Speakers today. First, I really would like to thank, well, that's what I said, the foundation. And let me start, please, this short presentation, 20 minutes, with a brief quotation taken from a letter to the woman he loved. 9 o'clock in the morning. De Gasperi is dead. Serious emotion, real grief, bad omen. This is how, in a rather telegraphic style, Paul-Henri Spaak, once again Belgian Minister for Foreign Affairs since 4 months, immediately reacted to the passing of Alcide de Gasperi in August 1954. Even if this quote shows the esteem with which Spaak considered the Italian statesman, this, of course, does not say a lot about the relations between Italy and the Benelux in the post-war period. Such a topic is certainly not an easy one. More than 10 years ago, Professor Antonio Varsori already noted that, and I quote again, the relationship between Italy and Belgium has never been a favorite topic for both Italian and Belgian diplomatic historians, and the post-war period is not an exception in this not too bright picture. This observation, I think, certainly applies to the 3 Benelux countries. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that among the 3 partners, Belgium is certainly the one which had, by far, the most profound relations with Italy since Luxembourg was regarded in Rome as too small and the Netherlands probably as too Protestant and too oriented to the British world for being perceived as important partners or close allies to make the European integration process move forward. Indeed, the archives of the time show that as far as Italy's foreign policy towards European integration was concerned, the Italian authorities perceived Belgium as a more relevant actor, since this country was, they thought, able to exert some influence on Western Europe's future. However, frankly said, there were not so many occasions for Italy and the Benelux countries to develop joint and concrete actions in the diplomatic field. In this regard, is it really necessary to recall here that at the end of the Second World War, Italy and Belgium found themselves in very different international situations. Italy was indeed, it has been said this morning, a defeated country that was trying, among serious difficulties, to recover an international status, although it was blighted by huge social, economic and political problems. Belgium, on the other hand, was one of the victorious powers, and its industrial potential had been largely preserved. Its colonial situation, too, remained intact. Moreover, the implementation of the Benelux Customs Union seemed to give this country one step ahead on the international scene. But in the same time, Italy and Belgium were facing a situation of political instability, due, for example, to the relation of the government parties with the communists, or the so-called royal question in the Belgian case. It has often been pointed out, this morning, for example, that in the immediate post-war years, in the new context of the Cold War, Italy's first goal in the international field was the recovery of the status of a sort of middle-rank power, which could have some influence on the two traditional spheres of Rome's foreign policy, Europe and the Mediterranean Middle East. In this connection, Rome's diplomatic activities usually pointed out the great powers, the US, the Soviet Union, Britain and France, as Italy's most important interlocutors. However, Rome's interest in the Belgian situation, or the Belgian international position, appeared to increase when in spring 1947, Alcide de Gasperi formed a new government and appointed Count Carlo Sforza as foreign minister. Sforza, it must be said, had lived in Belgium for several years in the interwar period as an anti-fascist activist. His personal commitment for European unity was well known, and he did not fail to recall this when he came to Brussels in 1949 as an incoming member of the Royal Academy of Belgium. With de Gasperi and Sforza, the Italian government was finally in the position of launching its European policy, which, for example, found expression, it has been said again this morning, in Rome's enthusiastic but realistic support to the Marshall Plan. However, this personal commitment for more European cooperation did not prevent Italian leaders to some disappointments. For example, Alcide de Gasperi was unpleasantly surprised to learn that Benelux representatives were not so supportive of an early membership of Italy to the so-called Western Union, which had been established in March 1948 by the signature of the Brussels Treaty of Economic, Social and Cultural Collaboration and Collective Self-Defense between, recalled by Sylvain Schirman, France, Great Britain, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg. But Italy did not change course. We all know that European cooperation soon became key expression in the Western European scene in the late 40s, beginning 50s. And for many Italian observers, it is also clear that Belgium was seen as a stable and wealthy nation whose economy had come out of the war in better conditions than in the pre-war years. This opinion was particularly reflected by de Gasperi in November 1948 in his speech at the Grande Conférence Catholique that he made in Brussels. But it's also clear that in the opinion of both Italian politicians and diplomats, Belgium's European policy was primarily Spaak's foreign policy. So, for example, in the first report he sent to Rome about Belgium in 1948, 1947, the newly appointed Italian ambassador in Brussels, De Nobili di Vezzano, argued that Brussels' foreign policy was strongly, if not only, influenced by SPAC, who enjoyed, he said, an incomparable prestige at the international level. Reporting of his first meeting with SPAC, the Italian diplomat showed an enthusiastic view of SPAC's positions, stressing that his opinions were similar to the ones nurtured at the same time by Sforza, as regards, for example, the project for a French-Italian customs union. In this regard, we know that the Benelux countries finally accepted to start negotiations with France and Italy on an enlarged customs union, the so-called Finebel plan of Fritalux. You said something about this, which ultimately, finally, never came into effect. It has been kept in mind that for Italian diplomacy, the Benelux was seen as an inspiring experience which influence was destined to increase. What the three countries had managed to achieve in a very difficult situation, already during the Second World War, in exile, and in a short period of time, was a source of admiration and often a model. The Italian ambassador was even more enthusiastic when he was explaining to Rome authorities that, I quote, Belgium's prosperous economic situation, the comparative tranquility of its political life, the maturity and soundness of its ruling elite, both the right and the left, make this nation a happy example of how it is possible to reconcile respect for human personality, economic freedom, a moderate dirigisme, social justice and welfare for everybody. It is therefore not surprising, I think, that he also suggested for Italy to strengthen its economic ties with Brussels, since Belgium was more and more regarded as a favorable labor market for Italian immigration. As a matter of fact, in June 1946 the two governments had signed an important agreement which paved the way to the employment of tens of thousands of Italian immigrants in the Belgian coal mines. The opening of labor markets to Italian unemployed workers thus became a key factor, and even, I have to confess, sometimes a source of tension of the relations between the two countries. As we know, dealt initially in a purely bilateral framework, this issue gained later a new community dimension since the treaty establishing the European Coal and Steel Community, which came into force in 1952, facilitated specialized workforce recruitment across national borders of the six. It's the famous Article 69. But in the same time, as I said, even if Belgium was still regarded in Rome as a leading member of the Benelux, the Italian authorities focused their main attention on bigger countries, as Italy wanted at first to recover a stronger international status and be recognized as a relevant player like France or Britain, the two countries which were at the time Rome's points of reference on the European scene. The appointment of conservative Paul van Zeeland as Belgian Minister for Foreign Affairs in 1949 was also a significant change for Belgian-Italian relationships. It was now clear for Italian observers that Belgium would pay more attention to strictly economic matters, but would also develop a much more cautious attitude towards the pro-federalist approach to European integration. It didn't take long before this shift in the Belgian orientation became apparent. In 1950, indeed, Italy and Belgium gave a positive answer to both the Schuman Plan and the Pleven Plan for a European army. They were equally convinced of the merits of the political objectives of such projects. During the negotiations of the Schuman Plan for the placing, as we all know, of Franco-German production of coal and steel as a whole under one common high authority, the three Benelux countries shared some common views. On numerous occasions, their opinion even contrasted with the ones put forward by France and Germany. Like the Italian delegation, they often feared that a European community with strong supranational characters would mean to a Franco-German hegemony. That's the reason why Belgians were so in favor of having a Council of Ministers that could balance the strong powers given to the high authority. On those issues, the Italian delegation often sided with the three Benelux countries, as the Rome authorities were too suspicious also of a Franco-German leadership. The fact is that reactions in Italy to the Schuman plan were generally favorable. Alcide de Gasperi displayed great enthusiasm, even if he was well aware that Italy's weak, heavy industry sector still required protectionist measures in order to allow it to adapt to new levels of international competition. Did not, for example, it was a question at the time, did not the French initiative offer a means to ensure the necessary modernization of the nationalized steel industry? It must be said, too, that this profound commitment to European integration did not exclude, on the contrary, the quest for national interest. For de Gasperi, as for all the so-called founding fathers of the European communities, European integration and national interests were indeed the two faces of the same coin. But in his opinion, the plan, the Schuman plan, above all provided Italy, I'm talking here about de Gasperi, provided Italy with the opportunity to return at last to the international scene on an equal footing with those countries which had defeated it in war. This explains why I think the Rome government regarded Germany and France with envy as the most important partners. In Italy's views, the Benelux countries should of course remain useful partners, but Italy could not risk to be labeled as a minor nation, and its interests were closely tied to those of the major Western European countries, Britain, France, and Germany again. If today the European coal and steel community can be seen as a successful story, the same does not apply to the European defense community. As a result, in 1950, of the Pleven Plan for the establishment of a German army within the confines of a European structure, Italy and the Benelux countries agreed they had to bow to pressure from the United States for accepting the rearmament of the Federal Republic of Germany. They were also equally interested, like France, in a political and institutional solution that would offer the tightest controls on Germany, Western Germany. But as far as Belgium was concerned, the Brussels government had also some strong reservations. For example, it did not favor the appointment of a common defense minister or the creation of a common budget. It was in this difficult context that even if the Rome government also feared that the creation of the EDC could lead to a potential Franco-German hegemony, that de Gasperi jumped at the opportunity to launch his, and it's well known, political grand design for the so-called Little Europe via the creation of a European political community. Indeed, having abandoned all hope of ever seeing the existing Council of Europe to become a real European political authority due to its purely intergovernmental functioning, the pro-Europeans among the six looked for a new way of ensuring the development of a European political statute, affording leadership and democratic control over the future European army. This would become for several months the cornerstone of Italy's European policy. Indeed, de Gasperi was responsible for the insertion in the treaty instituting the European Defence Community of the famous Article 38, which envisaged the creation of an authentic European political community. Accordingly, after the signing of the draft treaty establishing the EDC in May 1952, without even waiting for the European Defence Community Assembly to take up office, the governments of the six entrusted the European Coal and Steel Community Assembly, which was chaired at the time by Paul-Henri Spaak, with the task of drafting a European political statute within 6 months. However, in order to conform to the draft EDC treaty, the so-called ad hoc assembly had to be enlarged in order to include the required number of delegates laid down for each country in the future EDC assembly. 3 delegates each for Germany, France and Italy were immediately co-opted, but no one from Benelux countries. Of course, as you can easily imagine, Rome's proactive attitude did not fit very well with Van Zeeland's more cautious approach. When de Gasperi stated in Strasbourg his firm belief in the creation of a European defense community with strong political implications, Van Zeeland confirmed its prudent attitude, as he was mainly concerned about the consequences of such a radical development on Belgium's constitution and national sovereignty. Already in 1952, Van Zeeland has expressed very clearly to the Italian Minister for Finance, Giuseppe Pella, also a Christian Democrat, his personal opposition to the idea of making the ad hoc assembly a constituent assembly. The Italian embassy in Brussels, which sometimes was regretting that Spaak was not longer Minister for Foreign Affairs, even pointed out the negative views of numerous Belgian politicians regarding Rome's commitment to a federalist approach, which was alternatively considered as naive, or rather as an indirect instrument to achieve the most obvious Italian goal, namely the opening of the European labour markets for Italian immigration. And here is something I think very important, because if the case of Italian immigration in Belgium is now very well known, it's probably not the case for what regards the Belgian Congo in the early 50s. At this time, indeed, the Italian authorities questioned several times in international fora the colonial powers on the possibility of accepting in their overseas territories the settlement of surplus workforce from Europe. Just think about the Council of Europe, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, or the International Labour Office. The question was also raised by most of the pro-European movements when they were developing the project of creating a Euro-Africa. Those approaches disturbed and irritated many Belgian diplomats and business circles representing the colonial lobby. The fear that Italy could still sustain colonial ambitions also played a role here. For the Netherlands, but mainly for Belgium as a colonial power which had a key position with Congo, right in the center of the African continent until 1960, this was a big issue. This feeling, which was really touchy for Belgian diplomats and leaders, came at least from the interwar period when Italy claimed for territories in Africa in the framework of the League of Nations. The reluctance of Belgium can be mainly explained, I think, by the fact that traditionally the Belgian colonial authorities exercised a strict, very strict control over the installation in the Congo of European citizens. And the colonial government indeed strived to select settlers highly specialized and likely to contribute to the national colonial work as technicians, breeders or funders. This is why the Congolese legislation on immigration had endeavored to establish on an individual basis of conditions intended to proceed to the extent of the possible to rigorous selection of moral, social and professional of immigrant candidates. So already in the framework of the Marshall Plan and its application in the overseas territories, representatives of the Ministry for Colonies did not fail to remember to the Italian government that it would be inappropriate to suggest that Congo was ready to receive on its territory a workforce composed by European, mainly Italian refugees. Already mentioned by the Assembly of the Council of Europe or in the Schuman Plan negotiations, this issue became very hot with the project of a European political community to which, as we said, Alcide de Gasperi attached so much importance. Indeed, Article 83 of the treaty posed for all nationals of the 6 member states the freedom to move within the community and to settle on the territory on another member state, including overseas, under the same conditions as the nationals of that state. Quite contrary to the Belgian colonial tradition of immigration, this point was thus strongly denounced because it reinforced in Brussels, in the spirit of the Belgian colonials and leaders, the idea that would make the Congo the convenient outlet of a European population overflow. Some even denounced even the danger of a sort of internationalization of the Belgian Congo. In Brussels, some quite openly criticized the Italians, who, it must be said, after the Belgians and Portuguese already represented at the time the largest national community, a white community, established in the Belgian Congo. So Italians were criticized to look for getting around the difficulty by becoming champions of the idea of Eurafrica and pleading for a pooling of colonial territories. However, this strong opposition to any kind of placement of European workforce in Africa did not prevent the colonial powers, especially the Belgium and France, to worry about the political consequences of this systematic refusal that they opposed to the Italian demands. Indeed, some wondered whether this might not push Italy, which had definitively renounced its right on Libya in 1947, in the camp of the anti-colonial countries, and thus joined the ranks of countries claiming at the United Nations for the independence of colonial territories. But here again, no way. For the political advisor of the Belgian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, Belgium couldn't give the Italians more favorable measures without soon extend this benefit to all foreigners in accordance with the most favored nation clause. He even mentioned the need to apply indirect means, such as the informal setting of quotas. In this context, Belgium did not hesitate to recall that it would be pointless to build hopes on Congo to absorb unemployment from a European country, namely Italy. As an example of this, it should be noted the statement made by the representative of the Belgian colonial lobby during the Eurafrican Days, organized in Napoli in the autumn of 1953 by Italian colonial circles, and in which there were discussions about the possibilities of European immigration in Africa, referring to the signature in 1946 of the Belgian-Italian agreement for sending, as I said, thousands of Italian workers in the Walloon mines. He reaffirmed that Belgium would never admit that Congo could be placed under the control of a supranational authority, and he concluded, "We are opposed to an internationalization of the colonies in any form, even with our Italian friends." All this does not exclude, as we already said, that both Italy and the Benelux countries were subject to strong American pressures for ratifying the European Defence Community. But again, Van Zeeland made clear to John Foster Dulles in Washington or President Eisenhower that he had scant confidence in the European political community. Italy was here again especially targeted. For lots of Belgian diplomats and leaders who were already engaged in a very difficult campaign for the ratification of the EDC Treaty in Belgium, Italy was sometimes seen, I have to admit, as an unreliable country, since they doubted that Rome's commitment to the federalist ideal had deep, sound and honest roots. The fear was again that European unity would only serve the priority for Italy to pour millions of unemployed people into other European countries. Of course, this situation was to change with the resignation of Alcide de Gasperi in 1953 after his electoral defeat, since his successor, Giuseppe Pella, had serious doubts about the federalist approach, and he paid less interest in European integration. As an irony of history, SPAC was just about to come back to business. Clearly, and it's my conclusion, it was not easy for Italy, Belgium and Benelux as a whole to be on the same page. I thank you very much.
Grazie, Etienne Deschamps.
Thank you, Etienne Deschamps. We are coming to the conclusion of our day. We have some time if you have questions or comments from the audience. Yes, we have a microphone also in case of need. I would like to talk about the issue of the Europeism of the Gasperi and stress its evolution at the beginning of the 50s that, just to simplify, will make him adhere to the federalist cause in close connection with Altiero Spinelli. This involves that a parliamentary way to the European integration was relaunched. This was started immediately after the war by movements like the European Parliamentary Union by Coudenhove de Calerge that had fostered the creation within the national parliaments of groups that see the presence of hundreds of members of parliament. This parliamentary way had been abandoned once the Schuman and functionalist method had been accepted. And when Monnet was forced to note that in the Schuman Declaration there was no mention of a European Assembly, Monnet replied that cela n'a rien à voir. This idea came back with the EDC upon the proposal by De Gasperi to insert Article 38, which would involve a study on an elective assembly and bicameral structure, a federal structure. This is a moment of great hopes. There is a huge activity of the European movement, and there was the committee of legal experts led by Deleuze, and for the first time, a possible European constitution was mentioned. The mandate to draw this project was given to a special assembly, and the assembly presented a project that will not have any outcome. Why? Why? Because this will clash with the hostile reality. Because when the constitution of political communities was mentioned, often different things were mentioned during the assembly, the special assembly, when it was discussed how to design this community. The Dutch delegation meant economic community. So there is a plurality of languages, and this explains how, after delivering the project of this assembly to the different governments, the governments will simplify it with the Intergovernmental Conference that will take place in Rome a few months afterward, and will reduce the scope of supranational elements. But most of all, the most important element, and here we may say that De Gasperi has underestimated or not, is the weakness of what should be the pillar of this political community, i.e. the EDC. Perhaps the fact, was underestimated the fact that in a country such as France, after the elections of '51, the difficulties towards the approval of this treaty that was originating from the Pleven plan were very strong. And sometimes we hear about the surprise, the shock of the vote of August 30, 54. In my opinion, the shock would have been exactly the opposite if the treaty had been ratified on that date, if seen that there was a sort of offensive that put together communists and Gaullists and Michel Debré against the EDC. He would mention the Affaire des Fous de la Quatrième République together with Raymond Agon. And so there is also the fear by the radical and socialist parties that these signs of detention that started to come from the communist world could be then complicated by a joining of the CAD. On March 6, 1953, Altiero Spinelli wrote in his diary, in the interest of the European construction, it could have been better for Stalin to have lived one more year. Would not be in the interest of someone else, but he sees very well this connection with the Cold War. Once the Cold War pressure attenuated, well, other pushes to the protection of a national identity came out, and a form of patriotism limited to the nation came out. I conclude by saying that when Edouard Herriot, on August 30th, 1954, supported at the National Assembly the question préalable that had blocked the vote on the EDC, he said that the army is the soul of the nation. I would like to know where the European army will take his. And this question received no answer.
Prego, chiedo altri interventi?
Are there any other people who would like to take the floor? Yes. I would like to add a couple of points on the position of the Gasperi and French on the EDC. First of all, we don't have to forget that at the beginning, the Italian position on the French proposal of a European army was not exactly the same as the very quick approval that the Italians gave to the Schuman Plan. It's totally different. It must be also added that, in my opinion, and in what I've seen in the French document, there is a wide opinion in the Quai d'Orsay that finally the change of the position of Eisenhower and the Americans on the proposal of a European army had the Gasperi change his mind. The Gasperi followed the negative opinion of the Defense General Staff, Italian General Staff, that was against this defense community. The same was for the Minister of Defense of that time, Mr. Acciani, if I'm not wrong. So there is a change that is a criticism that has been often done by the French for the diplomatic positions taken by the Gasperi, and very often Italy had no independence, no great independence in regards to the United States that were considered as the master. And France was not so much American-oriented in this period. And then, as Sylvain has said it, there is a change with the elections of June 1951 in France, with the weakening of the MRP and a push by Gaullists and communists. One thing that was not stressed enough is that Schuman was weakened in front of his party, because immediately after the elections, in several meetings with de Monton, that at the time was the president of the Assembly of the Council of Europe, and especially Pierre-Henri Cadjerène, that was the head of the group at the parliament, the MRP and the parliament. There was a violent opposition by these two people who preferred the Eden Plan. It is not the time now to go more in detail about the Pleven Plan, but it was the alternative solution proposed by the English to eliminate the EDC plan. So from this point of view, Schuman is almost forced to renounce his positions taken before de Gasperi. But a few months afterwards, Schuman, even before that this crime of August the 30 took place, Schuman lost his power and Bidault came back to power. And as you know, when he received as Minister of Foreign Affairs the report by Spaak, he said that these were seekers of adventure. And the most known expression by Bidault was to make Europe without destroying France. So from this point of view, the French position has always been the same. The French were always in favor of a vertical integration, sector per sector. This is what we can define as neo-functionalism. The Italians have ever seen the European construction as a horizontal construction with this part of constitutionalism for which the French felt horror because that was giving up of sovereignty. And then, this is not so much stressed, there was the risk with the EDC to lose control of the territories of the territoire d'outre-mer. And so, even if France in the treaty had been able to safeguard the autonomy and resources of these territories, then also with the war in Indochine, that was a problem also. A book was written on the convergence between the position of France in Indochine and the refusal of the EDC. Thank you. And I would like to say only one final word. We spoke about Alcide de Gasperi for one day. I would like to invite you to visit the archives of Alcide de Gasperi. These are open, and the commemoration of the 60th anniversary of his death is also marking the opening of the archives in Florence at the European University. These are open to the public, and we have individual visitors and also schools and groups that want to see this archive. So I hope that you, researchers, you could find new information. Maybe you will make some discovery. And so at this point, I invite you to come to Villa Salviati and see this treasure. By this, I would like to thank, first of all, the Honorable Laura Boldrini for inviting us and allowed us to stay in this wonderful room, a very prestigious room to me. It is the first time that I come to the Chamber of Deputies, and I'm very happy. I would like to thank the Foundation de Gasperi and Mr. Tarullo, in collaboration with us, work day and night to realize this meeting on Alcide de Gasperi. I would like to thank all the speakers this morning and the afternoon for their contributions. And last but not least, I would like to thank you, the audience, you all who have come here with us today, a day in which we analyzed in depth the history of Europe and as Professor Weiler and Professor Claes partially said, we ended up in the present, and we hope also in the future of this Europe. By this, I conclude this afternoon session. I wish to all of you a nice evening and a safe journey back for those who have come from outside. Thank you very much to all of you again.
The business card here, and you something about your email. Yes, of course. You forgot about that. Yes, yes, yes. But, I understand. Great. I have this, but I will give you another. Sure. Because, well, I have it's here, but here it's purely professional. So for that kind of thing. Etienne underscore non è un tirato